We are all slaves to the chains we impose upon ourselves. The first sorrow manifests feelings of helplessness, terror, and self disgust upon its readers, all masterfully orchestrated by the mind behind this distinctive genre of horror, Franz Kafka. Kafka was a product of a psychologically abusive upbringing brought upon by his father. He grew up timid, bookish, meek, and full of self hatred that would show in his style of writing, which his father dismissed. Kafka wrote in secrecy whilst working several jobs beneath him, such as in a law office and in an insurance company, all the while having a series of unsuccessful relationships, attributed to his vigorous sex drive, which saw him frequent brothels and consume an excessive amount of pornography. Kafka's writing resembles nightmarish and oppressive qualities that trigger a unique feeling of horror amongst his readers, known contemporarily as the Kafkaesque. The first sorrow is a telling of a trapeze artist's tragic obsession with his craft. Kafka narrates the story of an artist who falls down a rabbit hole of self destruction and unhappiness, and solely correlates his contentment through the perfection of his trapeze performance. The story describes the cost of genius and how the artist only sees happiness through his trapeze. Once the joy is taken out of the craft, he becomes enslaved by the art, ultimately losing himself in the process. Kafka begins his short story by promptly introducing a story protagonist. He describes the artist as a person of great renown and great skill. A trapeze artist, it is well known that this art practiced high in the domes of the great variety theaters is one of the most difficult attainable by human beings. Although with his high esteem in society come the caveats that most artists face. A painfully dedicated sense of perfectionism for their craft. First, just in striving for perfection, and later also as a habit that had become tyrannical. Because of this, he often disregards his basic human needs and social interaction in exchange for an isolated life atop his trapeze. Only sometimes did one of his gymnast colleagues climb up to him on the rope ladder, then both of them sat on the trapeze, leaned to the left and the right on the rope holds and conversed. This was the artist's way of life, and though lonely at times, justified his being. And besides, it was healthy up there. And when, during warmer times of the year, the side windows in the lantern of the dome were opened, and the fresh air and the sun penetrated powerfully to the brightening space, it was even beautiful. He was content. The trapeze artist was content. Or at least he would have been if it weren't for the traveling which he had shredded. The trapeze artist could have lived this way undisturbed if it had not been for the inevitable journeys from place to place, which he found extremely aggravating. This is when we first begin to see a shift in the story, a sort of trouble emerging in paradise. We start to see the extent of the artist's obsession with his craft and how being away from his trapeze strikes a seemingly irrational sense of anxiety within our protagonist. This establishes our first glimpse into the hollowness within the artist, his estrangement with reality, as a consequence to his compulsion to his work. We see that our protagonist has no sense of identity without the trapeze. He's enslaved to the trapeze, and perhaps to a greater extent, he has unified his sense of self within the trapeze. And so it would happen that the impresario, that is the manager of the trapeze artist, would always see to it that the process of traveling would be as fast and as painless as possible. It was true that the impresario took pains to see that the trapeze artist was spared any unnecessary extension of his suffering. Race cars were used for the journeys in the cities, whenever possible at night or in the earliest hours of the morning. But it was on this particular train ride that the artist had addressed the request to the impresario. Biting his lips, the trapeze artist stated that instead of one trapeze, as he had used for his acrobatics up until now, he would now always have to have two trapezes. Two trapezes opposite one another. To which the impresario agreed with the idea immediately. Moreover, the trapeze artist had stated that he would never again, under no circumstances, perform on one trapeze. This is a pivotal moment in the story, as it is under these requests that the artist had set himself up for irrefutable failure and misery. The artist was already tormented with a compulsion to preserve the perfectionist art form with just one trapeze. Yet, the addition of another would serve only to drive our protagonist to levels of dedication comparable to insanity. Hesitating and observing, the impresario explained his full agreement once again. Two trapezes were better than one, and this new arrangement was also advantageous because it added variety to the performance. Then, the trapeze artist suddenly began to cry, almost as to impose the question, when would this torment end? It is at this moment that we endeavor in the artist's total suppression to his craft. The imagery of the trapeze artist crying is both an agonizing and beautiful moment in the story. It pervades acceptance and entrapment to his art, and is furthered by the explicit sentiments of the artist. Just this one bar in my hands. How can I live? Our protagonist, in a state of delusion, ascertains that having two trapezes was perhaps the way it should have always been. The trapeze has transcended its way to being the entire life and identity of the artist. There was no turning back now. Kafka alludes to how society worships individuals who completely immerse their entire lives towards their careers, yet scorn the concept of individuality. The addition of a second trapeze is emblematic of the artist's titular first sorrow. He realizes that once he adds a secondary trapeze to his act, that he will never go back to the simplicity of just one bar in his hands, and that he will only continue to desire greater variety and seek increasing difficulty. More and more and more. He has become the victim of his own ego and folly. Similar to the story of Icarus, the artist's ambition would be his downfall. The short story ends with the impresario disturbed and dejected amidst the realization of the artist's imminent self-destruction. Fixated at the trapeze artist's sleeping face, he saw in the apparently quiet sleep in which the crying had ended how the first wrinkles began to etch themselves into the trapeze artist's smooth, childish forehead forever. The artist had fathomed that he was now fully immersed in the oppressive chokehold of his trapeze, and that he would never truly be satisfied. A silent, quiet torture he had placed upon himself, a self-imposed exile. Kafka's first sorrow is a reflection of the pitfalls of one's egocentrism, of the pain, the suffering, and baseless devotion that the trapeze artist had imposed upon himself in the pursuit of perfection was a front in trying to compensate for his individual inadequacies. Beneath all of the skill that the artist exhibits through the trapeze is an empty, lonely shell of a man. The trapeze is symbolic of the protagonist's heightened ego, as he looks down at the world through the towering vantage point of his trapeze. Yet, in the end, he is alone. And even on top of so many people, he remains dissatisfied with himself. The story disputes the narrative of individual industry yielding immediate joyfulness and satisfaction. While the artist did exert a freakish amount of time and effort to be at a position of extreme competency in his craft, the cost of it all was losing his identity. Kafka inhibits a sense of existential dread throughout his readers in the first sorrow, showcasing themes of unease through his depictions of society, as well as inciting the same feeling of awkwardness and asphyxiation felt by his characters onto the audience. Kafka provokes a familiar and personal sense of horror through the dynamism of the trapeze artist's characterization. As readers, we realize the irrational and unrealistic characteristics in the trapeze artist's boundless work ethic and phobia for transportation, yet comprehend the relatable aspects of the character expressed through his fears and anxieties. The fear of underperforming and the fear of failure are all surprisingly human dispositions that we as readers can easily insert ourselves into. The possibility of the trapeze artist being a part of us and exhibiting similar habits is a surprisingly real and incomparably terrifying prospect. We often find ourselves in positions where we work tirelessly to achieve certain goals or reach a particular endpoint without necessarily examining the reasons and motivations behind it. It's easy to fall into the trap of mindless diligence, pursuing our individual endeavors without any rhyme or reason, and that's what I believe Kafka portrays through the trapeze artist. Kafka urges us not to get caught up within the mindless routines of everyday life, reminding us to exert caution as not to become slaves to our own fears and impulses, whether it be in our academe or respective careers. If anything, I regard The First Sorrow as one of Kafka's lighter works that give implications of hope, albeit ending on a dreary, melancholic note. Kafka cautions his readers not to lose sight of themselves over trivial and insignificant, egocentric desires, while at the same time maintaining that dedication does yield notable results. That instead of emulating a life with self-imposed anxieties, enslaved and fueled by our own egomania, we may break free from our individual terror and self-disgust. Thank you.